All right, folks, welcome back. Welcome back. Hope you had a fantastic Thanksgiving break. It's now Saturday, so I'm taking advantage of the break to put this video out for you. Anyway, I'm going to try to cover Carrithers, Weine, Biesele, and Nerlich. And I'm really enjoying these chapters. I think it shows some really solid applications of some of the rhetorical theories we've been working with, hopefully also giving you some ideas as to what you might want to look at some point with your own work in rhetoric. This first article, oh boy, look at that word. Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Pretty sure that's terrible pronunciation, but anyway, it's an interesting term for many reasons. It's kind of this, I guess, idea of overcoming the past or overcoming the unmastered past. But the gist of the article is that a lot has been said about metaphor and how important metaphor is to understanding culture and understanding rhetoric culture. But what Carrithers wants to talk about is okay, if all this is true of metaphor, what about narrative? What kind of role can we have for narrative in this scheme? And he says that really metaphor and narrative, they're not mutually inconsistent. Instead, they can work together. They can be persuasive together. They can create this is on page 49, a consistent interpretation of a whole landscape of events and their aftermath. So really the key to this is and when he's talking about narrative, he's not talking necessarily about a formal story, once upon a time, blah, blah, blah. But instead what he's talking about story seeds. And you have to dig a little deeper into a speech that might not seem like a narrative at all. But nevertheless, you can find these story seeds in there and understand it in terms of narrative, even with characters and villains and I guess that's sort of the way a story kind of simplifies events to form something more coherent. We can do similar things with a rhetorical speech. So I was really excited about this. Somebody who likes to think about narrative. It was interesting to see how you can apply that same set of skills to rhetoric. So this is over on page 43 or thereabouts, overcoming the unmastered past. He's talking here about I forget the exact year. I think this might have been the 50s or 60s. I forget. But anyway, this Mueller Gangluf, and really just the problem in Germany at the time of what to think about your recent history. It's just kind of hard for me to even wrap my head around this, what this would be like. But being in Germany or Berlin, I suppose, after World War II, and how do you deal with your own country's shame over Nazism and all atrocities? I mean, it's terrible. How do you sort of mentally cope with it? How do you quote cleanse the German national consciousness? And so what Carrithers was saying, we can look at some of these speeches and see how he describes this as a narrative affording a psychic journey between a more comfortable present and a sickening, forbidding past. So thinking about how this narrative plays out and the role that people can sort of assume within that narrative. And that is a way to deal with this, the horrific past of Nazi Germany. And to do this, he's building on some work, as all these authors do. He's building on the work of Fernandez on metaphor. And Fernandez, I looked him up. He's got quite a few big, thick books about metaphor and culture and beyond metaphor and culture. But he seems to be a go-to person if you want to talk about metaphors and the importance of metaphor and cultural formation and whatnot. And it's one of his favorite terms is inchoate, the inchoate or the underdeveloped or undeveloped. Fernandez talks about the inchoate. I did look up some of his books and read through them just to kind of get a sense of what he's all about. And as usual, you're only getting these little sound bites from Fernandez in this article, when really the book as a whole is really interesting and filled with really vivid examples where he's applying all this stuff. He talked about the inchoate is like the darkness at the bottom of the stairs. It's one of the ways that Fernandez talks about this. I mean, you could think about it kind of just as something that's not filled in. And Fernandez talks about this as little kids. How do you become who you are? The I, the you, the me, the we, whatever it is. These are sort of pronouns that have to be filled in. And according to Fernandez, they're filled in by bringing some metaphor upon themselves. And Fernandez talks in his book about little kids, especially in cultures or countries where there's not a lot of machinery. They identify a lot with animals, and they're playing. And you might have done this as a kid, pretend to be a horse or pretend to be a donkey. And he says, I forget where he's talking about, but he's looking around. All these kids are the little boy pretends to be a donkey. And the older kids come around there and they jump over the donkey. And the kid's making donkey noises. And I guess Fernandez is looking at this and saying, look, we're still doing this. We need to do this because to figure out who we are, we kind of have to figure out who we're not. You're not a donkey, but you can sort of pretend to be a donkey, look at the world from that point of view. And that sort of process goes on and on and on until we become subjects unto ourselves. At least I think that's more or less the gist of this theory. It sounds interesting. I could definitely see some potential here. We think about, I was thinking about language and how many of our curse words, or not necessarily curses, but just, ways of describing each other, how often we fall back on basically animal metaphors. You might call somebody a donkey, or I don't have to say the words, but, I'm sure you could think of lots of curses that involve basically referring to somebody as an animal. So it seems to be a pretty interesting concept. I think to really grok it, I'd need to spend some more time with Fernandez. But anyway, that seems to be the gist of it. Over on page, then Carrithers is just saying, well, the same as all this is true for narrative as well. Maybe even more profoundly true of narrative than it is just a metaphor. So on page 48, we get into practical rhetoric. What can you do with all this stuff? And Carrithers says, this is on page 48, for the practical rhetorician, all the irreducible variety of any assemblage of people and the sheer complexity of any situation must be resolutely ignored and a simplifying version found in order to make that mental movement which leads to a performance. So he's trying to apply what Fernandez says in his about metaphor to this broader idea of a narrative. And then he brings in Lippmann to kind of talk about this a little bit. Lippmann says, these complex events that are always happening, crisis, whatever it is, they kind of bewilder us, right? We have to figure out a way to make sense of them. And he says that we tend to do that anyway by personalizing quantities, dramatizing relations. And it looks like I got cut off a little bit there, but the discrepancy between the oversimplification of collective nouns, I think that's just, and the variety of human life accompanies all such rhetoric. And so I see some similarities here to what Latour was saying, and you notice he even uses the term assemblage there. That's kind of a giveaway, right? But yeah, these, something's happening. You're in the midst of some crisis. You're looking over here, you're looking over there. It's just kind of a fire hose of information. How do you make any sense of any of this? How do you get to something like, what does the Latour call it? You sort of try to form a quote unquote big picture, but really that's just another little picture. But nevertheless, you have to have those. That's the only way you can get some kind of sense of it, or an understanding of it, I suppose, as opposed to saying I understand it. But anyway, to me, the keys here is this idea of ignoring some of the complexity, realizing, a lot's going to be left out. You're going to be simplifying. You're going to be, what's the word? It's going to be reductivist account, no matter how hard you try to account for everything. But nevertheless, that's necessary if you do want to have any kind of movement. So if you want to move, and I think, as far as I could tell, Carrithers here is talking about movement in the sense of being moved by a speech, right? And that leading you to some kind of action. I guess you could think about it this way too. If you're just trying to describe here's this crisis, this ongoing crisis, and it's too complex for anybody to get a grasp of it, and it's just kind of confusing what's going on, then you're not going to get to this movement. You're not going to get to the action you want. So in a way, you sort of have to be consciously. I guess the key here would be to be savvy about this and realize, yeah, you're going to have to ignore some stuff. You're going to have to simplify it. You just want to make sure you're simplifying and ignoring the appropriate things, and you're not leaving out what's actually important to the situation. So, anyway, I just again, this is pretty profound stuff. I'm not quite sure. I wouldn't say I completely grok what Carrithers is saying here. I feel like I have a pretty good grasp of the basics, but I'd be curious what you think about it. And that brings us to the first question. So Carrithers, he's talking, of course, about Mueller, Gangloff in his speech, and about overcoming the Nazi past and sort of what the Germans were going through mentally, trying to cope with this, all these atrocities in their, I guess, fairly recent past in the 50s or 60s, whenever this speech was given. And he wants to show how it's a political speech. It doesn't seem to be a story, but nevertheless, he finds all kinds of what he calls the story seeds in there, and talks about how you can interpret it basically as a narrative. So anyway, that brings me to this question. Can you think of another example, maybe something from American history, recent or something more distant, doesn't really matter. But anyway, something that shows how metaphor and narrative can, quote, work together to persuade and create a consistent interpretation of a whole landscape of events and their aftermath. So I can think of a few, perhaps, but I want to see what you think of this. And, who knows? Maybe it'd be something you'd like to pursue for a later project. Okay, now moving on to the second article, the Diffuse in Testimonies by Stephen M. Weine. Let's see, this is about survivors and testimonies, and not just personal traumas, but really, what's it called? I think at some point, this sort of cultural traumas, I suppose, or big traumas. It says this within a couple of terms here to get through. Let me just define these. So this is on page 56. He's talking about why even bother with a testimony, right? And he says, survivors give testimonies because they hope that their voices matter, and that telling the story may lead to some good for themselves or for others. So I agree with that. That seems to be spot on. That's fine. But the problem, he says, is with the professionals who are brought in, the analysts or counselors or I don't know, whatever they call themselves, right? The people trained to listen to these testimonies and record them. But he says these people actually shortchange the testimonies because they kill off the diffuse in them. We'll talk about what that means. But basically, they're trying to have too coherent of a framework, you might say. It's too much structure. They're too focused on what the people can get out of giving the testimony, right? The instrumentality. How can we make these more useful? A little too much directives, I guess. I kind of thought about if you work in the right place and you hear about the non-directive tutoring, it sounds to me like these professionals that Weine's talking about they're doing basically that directive, sort of what you're not supposed to do in a writing tutorial, right? They're sort of doing what you're not supposed to do in testimony by trying to be a little too visible there, or a little too, a little too directive, I suppose, giving too many instructions, interrupting too much, trying to rush through the process maybe, or fit everything into nice pigeonholes or whatever. But anyway, this is all to say that they're ignoring stories, meaning, history, and culture for the sake of precision. That's on page 57. So he wants to let testimony be the living story that it wants to be, and we have to expect both more and less of testimony and of ourselves. So I like where this is going. He brings in Bakhtin, dialogism. I'm actually not sure how to pronounce that. And testimony. And dialogism, this is a concept about voices and how voices speak and listen to one another openly and responsively. How words embody within themselves diverse, discriminating, often contradictory talking components. So this is a view of language. It's about as far as you can get, I suppose, from that sort of, well, there's the word and here's what it means, and there's no problem there, right? This is a much more, I guess, complex view of language. There's a lot less clear cut about language and discourse, according to this theory. It is often contradictory, even. And what Weine wants to do is apply this to the concept of a testimony. It says if we do this, if we apply this kind of thinking to testimonies, we'll be in a position to we'll be better able to diminish the suffering, to build cultures of peace and reconciliation, and document historical truth. This is on page 60. And so you can see, if you agree with this, it certainly would be paramount that we quickly move to embrace this, right? Because why bother, getting all these testimonies? Well, I mean, if the whole point of giving the testimony, right, is to lead to some good for themselves and for others, we'd certainly want to do that in the most effective way possible. And so let's go into more detail about how you might do it. So this is more Bakhtin here. Is bringing in some more terms from Bakhtin. I know some of you are familiar with his stuff, but concepts like polyphony, unfinalizability. Used to reading these, not so much saying them out loud. But anyway, diffuse testimonies are better able to embody the polyphonic nature of survivors' experiences. And the polyphony there, this idea of the poly being many, phony meaning sounds, a multitude of sounds or voices interacting with no predetermined results. So there'd be a lot in these testimonies that don't make sense or don't seem to be going anywhere per se. They're bringing in all these different layers. And again, I can see a lot of Latour here in this kind of thinking. But I kept wanting to scream out, follow the actors themselves, right? Listen to where the testimony or the person giving the testimony is going. Quit trying to intervene all the time. Encouraging testimonies that respect and convey the unfinalizability of traumas. So again, the idea not being, well, you've given the testimony, we can shut the book on it now. You're all better now, or however that would be possible, I don't know. So it's not about sort of closing the book on it so much maybe as it is about writing more and more books on it, or going even more places with the testimony. And I like this on page 61. Giving testimony is never guaranteed to produce any kind of helpful results. So again, this seems to be very Latourian sort of statement, right? People that are saying, well, what is the point? Or what are we going to get out of this testimony process? And how is this going to help me to give the testimony? How is this going to help anybody? It's a lot of work. Why bother? So it seems to be pretty honest admission here. Well, it's not guaranteed to do anything, right? You just, it's not an instrumental process. It's certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution. In fact, the receivers on page 62 should resist the tendencies towards monologism. Again, coming back to Latour, don't rush in with a pre-baked conclusion. Instead, you got to keep a very open mind and actually encourage, I guess you could say to a certain extent, kind of encouraging it to be confusing and complex and contradictory. I mean, those are actually signs you're doing a good job. The bad job would be rushing, headlong into some kind of premature, half-baked conclusion or wrap-up of the trauma. So anyway, this all makes a perfect sense. I really like where Weine goes in this piece. I did want to ask you, I've sort of mentioned it a couple of times, but how would you compare this concept of, I didn't really get into the novelist that was giving that he uses it as an example there of diffusion, but it seemed to have some overlap with Latour's actor network theory. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you think Latour would respond to this article? Do you think he would agree, or would there be points in here of disagreement? I'm just kind of curious what you think of that. Okay, so we're up to Article 3 now, Biesele's Medical Rhetoric in the U.S. and Africa. And this article, I couldn't say more nice things about it. I think I just love this idea of the dance this healing dance and the holistic medicine. I think it's, I got some more information about it there somewhere, of where it comes from. And the sort of coldness, I suppose, both for the physicians and for the patients that we run into in our healthcare system, and kind of what we could learn rhetorically from these other traditions. I think it's really profound. I don't know if you know Rex Veeder or not, but Dr. Veeder is a professor here that does a lot of work with healing rhetoric, and he's got a conference he puts on called Survive and Thrive. So if you wanted to do something with that conference or talk to Rex, I think he'd really like to hear more about this approach that Biesele takes in this article. That's on page 69. Social anthropology is nothing if not combined with rhetorical awareness. Amen to that. And she's going to locate this in the art of healing. She says, at the heart of healing lies the potential for a powerful dialectic that can draw the practitioner into the patient's experience. And she's relying there on a book by Arthur Kleinman. It'd be nice to look that book up if you want to delve more into this. Unfortunately, our healthcare system, medical care system, actually does the opposite of this, right? So it's not even just the generic, even you'd say, well, yeah, sure, but even our holistic system. So even the physicians in the U.S. that try to not to do this, that try to be more holistic, and nevertheless, they're still driving the practitioner's attention away from their experience and alienating the chronologically ill from the caregivers, and paradoxically to the relinquishment by the practitioner of that aspect of the healer's art that is most ancient, most got cut off there, and most existentially rewarding. So really, even according to Biesele, even the holistic doctors, right, they're still getting it wrong. They're actually ignoring, and they're leaving out this bit that would really have the most potential, the sort of the most beneficial aspect of the holistic approach. They're actually not employing. So it's a pretty big claim. It's certainly worth delving more into what she's talking about here. So this is over on page 71. We're talking about the hunter-gatherers of the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa. And I didn't put their name in here because I'm sure I would completely butcher the pronunciation. But anyway, that's not really important for us. What we're really looking at is this dance, this ancient healing dance, the rituals around this tradition. And she says it's, on the one hand, it's a very ancient dance. But on the other hand, it's always sort of revitalized, refreshed, because it brings in local conditions, newer social developments. It's a very, dynamic dance. It's capable of bringing in new elements all the time. It's not a problem. And so it's not like it's always the same routine every time. It's actually very adaptable, very flexible. It says the whole community, this is really the key, it seems to me, is that the whole community is involved, right? Everybody's involved, participating in the making of a single dynamic and unifying form. And she describes this dance in some detail. You can reread that or look it over again if you like. But it's very much opposed, again, even to this holistic medicine in the U.S., which, so instead of being this big communal process, it's the patient is an autonomous actor, her individuality valued, her inclusion. No, I'm sorry. This is, should say, unlike the U.S. holistic medicine, the patient is an autonomous actor, her individuality valued, her inclusion on the healing team given. And so this is opposed to the U.S. holistic medicine, where I think, what is it, oncology? So the oncologist comes in and she talks about, let's see, who is this? Biesele. It talks about how the doctor comes in and just says, well, it's a terminal case. And the patient saying, well, what about diet or nutrition? And the doctor just says, no, that's not going to help. It's not really listening to her point of view or thinking that she might have something to contribute there. And this is even with the holistic medical approach in the U.S. So you can see how that could be problematic. Also, the Kalahari, or in the Kalahari, there's the healer is not blamed if things don't go right. on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's this idea that, yeah, there could be this miraculous recovery. So it's not their fault. And I guess there would be no such thing as a truly terminal case because the gods could intervene, right? As a that's it's not really up to the physician. So you can see some. I think the kind of the key differences here. One, the idea that the doctor is the only one that has any impact on the treatment. The patient, clearly doesn't know anything. They're not the expert. I think this article would beg to differ on that. Say we should listen. Again, kind of like what Latour says, right? What makes you think you're up here somewhere and the patient's down here doesn't know anything? You're the only one with any knowledge. Maybe you should actually listen to what the patient is telling you, right? And not just dismiss it. So there's a little bit of Latourianism there, I think. And also like this idea of, you never know what could happen on the one hand. And you don't want to feel real guilty as the doctor either if the patient passes. Let's see, what do we have here on page 84? Charon, there's just, you know about the Styx, the river Styx and the myths associated with this. She invokes that throughout this article. This is on page 84. She says, the rhetorical dialogue involving healer and patient can profoundly determine, if not the outcome of the illness process, every motion of their entwined minds as they step together towards the shore. And that's just one of those, I kind of tear up a little bit reading this, even though I've read it a couple of times now. It's just such a powerful, beautiful image there. And I think there's some real truth to it. I'm reminded reading this article of the Socratic dialogue, Gorgias. And Gorgias is this big sophist, really famous sophist, a very persuasive guy, you might say. And Socrates gets into an argument with him about basically who's more valuable, right? You or your brother? Because his brother is this physician, this really eminent healer, I guess you could say. And he says, well, who's more important to your well-being? You, the sophist, or this healer? Your brother. And Gorgias says, actually, I'm more important than the healer. My brother, he's a great doctor, but a lot of times he's unable to convince anybody. His patients come in and he'll know the right treatment, but it might be a very unpleasant treatment. I mean, imagine ancient Greek medicine. I mean, who knows? You're probably rubbing feces all over you. Who knows? The patients will balk at this, not want to do the treatment. So he says the healer, his brother, will call him up. Hey, bro, come on down and talk to this patient for me. See if you can convince the patient to undergo the treatment. And so I was kind of reminded of that aspect a little bit. But I was also thinking too here about, I don't know if she really goes into this, but I've heard time and time again about how important it is for the patient to want to recover. A lot of times patients can get depressed, or they can just sort of give up, I suppose, and reconcile themselves to an outcome. And that can kind of become a self-fulfilling prophecy, at least that's my understanding. So I see there perhaps another role for a rhetorician. If you are feeling really down and maybe you don't even want to recover, maybe that could be a rhetorical part of that rhetorical healing process, right? Might be to, convince you to, change your view about it, right? Or not to give up hope. So that's just my little thought there. So question number 3 for you. Biesele's talking here about medical rhetoric, problematic relationships between doctors and patients and the community, kind of excluding or alienating people in this process and the trouble you can get into there. And I wanted to ask you this. Do you see anything like that going on with teaching? It could be teaching writing or perhaps tutoring. I've talked a little bit about how in the right place, there's a non-directive tutoring method. And you could think about, well, why do they have that method? What's wrong with being directive? I could sort of see some connections there, but maybe also with composition. But anyway, I don't want to say much more. I'm really interested in what you think. So what do you think about this? Do you see some overlap here? Okay, so let's finish up here with Nerlich. And this is, I think, wins the award for the best title so far. As if Goya was on hand as a marksman. So try to wrap your head around that. Anyway, this article is about foot and mouth disease. And I didn't know a lot about this, but apparently there was this tremendous disease going on in the UK, and a lot of the livestock came down with this, and this massive slaughter of the animals. I mean, a really horrific crisis. If you love animals, I mean, this is just a kind of a nightmarish scenario. But the article is about how the UK and I guess the media and the politicians involved, how they were using metaphor to get across the concept of and what needs to be done, and they focused on this. They fixated on this metaphor of war. So it's we're at war with the foot and mouth disease, and so that was war is a common metaphor. It was easy to get across. People could grasp that pretty easily, but it kind of backfired because the literal war, the metaphorical war, got to be a little too much like the real thing, as a result of the images and I guess photographs and videos or whatever showing the slaughtering process. So it really shocked a lot of people, and it seems like the concern is next time something like this happens, there might be a lot of opposition as a result of this. They wouldn't have been there before if they had just been a little bit more savvy, rhetorically savvy in their choice of metaphor. So this idea that there was instead of just killing the animals, you could have vaccinated them. I think I'm understanding that right, but that solution wasn't chosen because it was harder. There's a lot of fear about foot and mouth disease, and people thought, just vaccinating the animals doesn't sound effective, right? The disease could still be transmitted. What we really just need to do is kill them, slaughter them. And what's really disturbing there is, this vaccination could have saved a lot of lives, a lot of animal lives, but it wasn't chosen simply because it was harder to get across. You need some knowledge of, I guess you need more scientific literacy and faith in science, I suppose, or trust in science to agree to that solution over this other one. So to me, this is disturbing on a whole number of levels. But anyways, it's definitely something we need to think about. And let's see, Nerlich. I don't think I wrote down the person's first name. But anyway, we got Wagner here. Let me get Nerlich's name. Brigitte Nerlich. All right, so she relies on Wagner et al.'s collective symbolic coping, which this is another one of those, sounds like a great theoretical framework if you wanted to do something like this for a thesis. It actually sounds quite readable and coherent the way this theory works. But anyway, the symbolic coping, this is over somewhere in the 90s, early 94, 93, somewhere around there. So symbolic coping occurs at times of increased political activity and of media reporting, which alerts the public. So that's when this symbolic coping takes place. So I think you could argue we're kind of going through this right now. There's a lot of increased political activity and media reporting, alerting the public to something. So at these times, when this is going on, according to this theory, the public shows a high proportion of beliefs in menacing images. That sounds kind of familiar. These beliefs are relatively independent of pre-existing popular science knowledge. And they are functionally equivalent to scientific knowledge in providing judgmental confidence and reducing self-ascribed ignorance. So I'm trying to avoid giving you the obvious examples here, but I'm sure you're probably thinking the same things. But you can see the danger there, right? So this is independent of actual, pre-existing science knowledge. It's just some kind of menacing image that sort of takes on a life of its own. And the really scary part is this idea that it's functionally equivalent to the scientific knowledge. So people might be out voting for a policy and feeling pretty good about that, even though it's completely contradicts the scientific knowledge at the time. Uh, so I see this going on right now. I don't know about you. So collective symbolic coping is the activity of a collectivity which attempts to maintain the integrity of its worldview, making sense of any new phenomenon. So, well, this sounds about, this couldn't get any more spot on, right? I'm going to really have to look this Wagner et al. Book up. So there's 3 stages of this coping mechanism, the collective symbolic coping. So first, the new phenomenon must be communicated as being relevant and as challenging the taken for granted a desirable way of life. So it can't be just this innocuous thing. It's just frivolous. Doesn't have any bearing on our day-to-day life. Instead, this is something that really has your attention, you're concerned about, and as a collective. So that's the first step. Second one is various interpretations, images, and metaphors emerge in media and conversations which render that new phenomenon intelligible. I think we could go back to what Carrithers was saying there too, right? These narratives come out, and so almost by definition, they have to be simplistic in a way. They have to be reductivist in a way. There's no way to get the whole picture, whatever that would be. So you're going to have to latch onto one of these, though, to make any sense of what's going on, right? And it sounds like they're kind of competition with each other, and this will have consequences, which brings us to the last one. Finally, the interpretations may consolidate or give way to a more scientific, accurate understanding in the long run. The image beliefs will gradually fade. So finally, the interpretations may consolidate or give way to more scientific, accurate understandings. These beliefs may gradually fade. So we could think about all kinds of cases of this. I'm trying to think about some relatively new ones. I was thinking about something like climate change or autism. Basically any newish phenomenon in the sense of the last decade or so. But I could see these all 3 of these steps coming out. The menacing sort of images that really spark a lot of debate, get everybody's anxieties up. And these might take a very, very long time to reach this third and final step where the fear sort of abates and I guess conspiracy theories or whatever give way to the more intelligent, I don't want to say more intelligent, but anyway, more scientific view. I guess I'll just stick to that. But I'm sure you could think of many other examples of this. Which brings us to my 4th and final question for you. So Nerlich's using the UK's foot and mouth disease and the slaughter that went on there. It's a very gruesome example. And it certainly does show, though, what can go wrong with that choice of metaphor. If they had found a way to make that vaccination metaphor more compelling, might have led to a very different result, right? And we're also thinking in terms of what happens when inevitably, what happens when the next sort of disease comes on the scene? Are people going to be, if people reject this, maybe it'll be necessary, but people will reject it. And it could lead, who knows where it might lead next time. So there are some really, keep you up at night concerns about this. But anyway, let's come away from the foot and mouth disease. See if you could think of another example of this collective symbolic coping in action. And also I wanted you to think too about the outcomes. If there is a competition for metaphor, and we go with this one metaphor over another one's, or this menacing image takes on, gets a really good grip, what could be the outcome for a nation? So not just individuals, but, sort of a national outcome, good or bad. You might think of a positive one too, right? It doesn't have to be bad. But I just want to see if you could think of some other examples. Anyway, we'll leave it there. Hope you enjoyed this. Just about done with the semester. If you do want to come by the office to talk about paper topics or anything, that's fine. Email me is always fine. But anyway, I'll leave it here and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for watching.